Okay, so in the second part of our guided tour of medical software, we look at the back end of the process. Now, we stopped last week at the requirements, what our software has to do at an abstract level to meet the needs of our user. And now we're going to talk about the back end of the process, the software design, the testing, and then the supporting processes that are involved in doing that. So first, we'll talk about software design. As an example of a software architecture design. This is for our image-guided neurosurgery case study example. We'll talk about this in week 7. And what you're seeing here is 3 pieces of software. The thing that the surgeon will use in the operating room, let's call it part A. Part B is a back-end database system. Part C is what will be used outside the operating room to plan the procedure. The boxes in blue are the modules. They are the big functional components of the software. And the outside world here is represented by the hospital database and the tool tracking. What you're seeing in these lines is how these modules will communicate, what talks to the outside world, and what the piece of software look like. With that high-level design, we also produce an initial design of the user interfaces for tools A and C, the user-facing tools, and they might look something like this. This might be sketches. This one at the top is inspired by the BrainLab Vivi cranial system. This is what it looked like 15 years ago. The one at the bottom is from our own open source work with the Yale Bioimage Suite software package. The next step after you design is you have to implement and test your code. And testing is an interesting process. And in the beginning, you want to find actually lots of things. If you're not finding bugs in the beginning of testing, you're not testing correctly. But you want that flow to go down. You want this curve to decay. So in the beginning, you find lots of bugs. That means that your testing process is robust and it's catching things. But by the end, you want that number to go down, which means that you're actually fixing them, catching them, fixing them, and you're doing a good job. In week 9, we'll take a detour from the actual software lifecycle to talk about math and probability, statistics, decision theory, a little bit of an introduction to all of those topics that underlie the development of medical software. A key process is this process of signal detection. What you're seeing on the screen is a radar screen here, and you're seeing this blip that will appear here. And the radar operator, and think yourselves back to World War II when these things were introduced, is that an enemy plane? Do I have to scramble up a fighter to defend my area against that, or is that noise and I just don't do anything? And obviously there's a cost to doing something. If it's not a plane, you're wasting fuel, you're wasting resources, and there's a cost to not doing something when it's in fact a plane, you get bombed. So a lot of the issues with decision theory is this trade-off of the cost of action versus the cost of inaction. And the same, of course, applies to the medical world, the medical software. Let's say that our piece of software is measuring the likelihood that you have a brain tumor, and we have a number from 0 to 1. 1, we're sure there's a brain tumor. 0, there's no brain tumor. At some point, we have to set a threshold and say, well, anything above 0.7 we'll call it a brain tumor. Anything below 0.7, we're not going to call it a brain tumor. And the trade-off, the way you set that value of 0.7 is how many tumors can you afford to miss, and versus how many times can you afford to have somebody be told that they have a tumor and all the extra medical procedures that will involve when in fact there's not a tumor. So this is what's called the trade-off between sensitivity, missing things, and specificity. When you say that there's something there, it is in fact there. So this is a key problem in medical software, and we'll spend some time talking about it in week 9. It also underlies how we evaluate machine learning, artificial intelligence algorithms, which try to detect things in images. Did something happen? This is the kind of thing we're talking about. In week 10, we'll talk about validation. Validation, again, we'll talk about this in more detail again later. But validation means that our software meets the needs of our user. And when we're talking about a medical piece of software, it means that it does something useful in the clinical world. And this breaks down into 3 steps. What the FDA calls valid clinical association. Is our software measuring something that's relevant to the disease? If our disease is prostate cancer and we're measuring tumor volume of a lesion, maybe that's useful and relevant. If we're measuring something unrelated to the disease, this is a waste of time. So this is a first step, showing that what we measure is actually relevant to the disease. The second component is analytical validation. The thing we measure that is relevant to the disease, we're actually measuring accurately, and this is what analytical validation means. And the third step is what's called clinical validation. The thing that's relevant and that we measure accurately, in fact, is useful for some clinical procedure. So those are the 3 components of the validation process, and we'll come back to this, especially in week 10, when we'll talk about validation in more detail. In week 11, we'll begin to talk about machine learning and artificial intelligence. And this is revolutionizing the medical software field. It's beginning to allow us to solve problems that we didn't know how to solve before. And you can see a workflow here. The upper end is what happens in the lab. We have data, we split to training and testing data, we learn an algorithm, and then we apply this algorithm on a performance side with a different set of data to get proper deployment and monitoring. And this is an evolving area. We're still developing best practice for it. The regulatory world is still discovering how to do it. I mean, we have some ideas, and you'll see some documents in Week 11 from various countries. But to say that this is an area that's in flux, and the agencies are also trying to figure out how to do it. And a big challenge in particular is that with all of these machine learning algorithms, you need more and more data. And one way to get more data is to update the system in production. Every time we get a new image that we classify, we add it to our database as a new example. And how you manage that safely without introducing more problems is a challenge that everybody's trying to figure out right now. And finally, in Week 12, my colleagues Dr. Khalid and Dr. Nikolai will talk about business considerations in medical software. We'll talk about the changing models in healthcare, the nuts and bolts of starting the new healthcare venture, and when and how to raise capital and related issues that you're going to deal. There are lots of opportunities for software digital health to redefine how healthcare is done. The recent pandemic is changing healthcare with telehealth and other issues, and there's lots of opportunities here, and this is an interesting area to think about. For those of you who are not interested in doing a startup and ask, why do I need this? And the answer is, in any organization you work, you may not be directly responsible for raising money or intellectual property or meeting customers, but this is what your bosses, your managers are worrying about. So this is important, understanding what your organization is doing, even if you're not directly responsible. I think you'll find this part useful as well. So this concludes our guided tour. In the next segment now, we're going to begin to talk about the regulatory process and introduce some concepts from there.